My name is Alex. I'm a ranger at the James A. Garfield National Historic Site, filling in for Andrew, who is the ranger that actually made the presentation here, so obviously just as knowledgeable and qualified. Without further ado, we're going to get started. So the main goal here is we're going to be talking about mapping the Civil War, more of the ethics about archaeology and what we learn from archaeology. So this won't be about the entire Civil War, or the history of the Civil War in general. It's going to be focusing more on the archaeological side and what we're able to learn from archaeology. So hopefully that keeps all of your interest, doesn't knock anyone out. But the Civil War occurred about 180 years ago over the time period of 1861 to 1865. At that time, photography and other detailed written records and material are still the subject of research and general interest to this day. And by uncovering and studying what's left behind in and on the land, we're able to better understand exactly how and why the war itself took place, what those fighting in it would have felt themselves. And when we hold these archaeological materials, we hold items that once belonged to real people. And even if we don't know the names, faces of the people that left these items behind, we have to remember that these objects were once very important to living human beings. From every munition to every boot, button discovered from people that once fought during the Civil War. We also have to remember that these items represented a life or death struggle taking place on the very lands that we now step. Though this program itself will focus on the more technical side, it is also important to have the more philosophical components associated with it. Now, this program is broken up into a few different parts. We're going to start out looking at a brief overview of exactly what archaeology is, so that everyone here will have a solid basis for what I talk about a little bit later. We will also go over information regarding the ethics and rules, along with the regulations that we have to follow while conducting archaeological research on Civil War sites. We will also discuss some of the different methodologies and technologies being applied today to conduct this research, including GIS, or Geographic Information Systems, and LIDAR, which is Light Detection and Ranging. We will also go over what makes the Civil War archaeology so unique compared to other archaeological sites and digs. So the question that might be on everyone's mind, what is archaeology? Well, in its most basic concept, archaeology itself is a subdivision of anthropology, and anthropology is the holistic studies of humans. Besides archaeology, the anthropology umbrella encompasses linguistics, cultural and physical anthropology. There is also applied anthropology, but that's not really important for what we're going to be going over today. By definition, archaeology itself is the studies of past humans or their cultures based on materials that have been left behind. Though by definition, archaeologists only study material remains, researchers that focus on more specific historical time periods or events like the Civil War will also study documents like journals, diary entries, maps, and other written works that have survived up until this time. And those works help locate different locations where archaeological sites might be able to take place and give us more knowledge to know more about what these areas and the people might have been going through. As you may be able to infer, understanding how to study history itself can play a major role in how well we are able to conduct archaeological research. Another related field that archaeologists have to be well versed in is geology. And as we will discuss a little bit later, understanding how to tell different soils apart from one another, or even being able to identify different types of stone, can often impact the quality of your archaeological investigation. Now, it's important to understand that as well as the material remains archaeological sites invite studies for, there are three different types of artifacts. We have artifacts themselves, features, and then the sites. And in this first slide, I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on artifacts. Artifacts themselves are the actual objects left behind that we can excavate and study further in a lab or a museum setting. In the case of the Civil War, artifacts may include bullets, uniform fragments, weapons, camp supplies, along with a lot of different other examples. Seen in the photo here, we have a few examples of some Civil War artifacts from Fort Stevens near Washington, D.C. We can see a few bullets as well as fragments from a cannon shell. And as items like these are discovered during an investigation, they're also able to be safely removed, documented, photographed, and then stored or preserved appropriately. Now, the next part I'll go into a little bit more are the features. And features are things like the small remains of buildings or trenches that are just things that we can tell are made by humans, but we cannot feasibly remove from the landscape. So, for example, if we were to excavate a Civil War era fort, any existing walls, floors, or doorways would be considered features, as they are able to be documented and studied, but we cannot remove them from the site itself. And finally, outside of artifacts and features, we have the site. Now, artifacts and features represent the things that humans actually made, and the sites themselves are the areas in which events took place. For example, a battlefield or an area of a fort during the Civil War may be considered an archaeological site. Sometimes only certain sections of these existing locations will be considered active archaeological sites. And most Civil War parks or sites that you can visit today typically have done thorough work to ensure visitors will not often stumble upon a new discovery, although it does occasionally happen. Now, I've gone over a little bit about archaeology and what you might find, so now we're going to talk more about how archaeology itself is done. The simple answer is it's done slowly, carefully, and very systematically. Archaeologists have to take great care when conducting these surveys and excavating the sites. They obviously don't want to break or accrue any further damage onto any of the artifacts that they uncover, but they also have to record the position and location of the artifacts and the features accurately. This means that for every find, they have to record where an item was, as well as what layer of the soil it was found in, and by doing this, we are able to figure out what is most important for research, and that itself is context. Now, we're going to go a little bit more into the archaeological process step by step, and the photo we have here shown in front of you is an excavation that was done at Bull Run, which is a National Park Service site. Now, the first thing that needs to be done for archaeology to happen is we have to have a site in which we can start looking for things. Archaeologists studying the Civil War often find sites by studying primary resources from the time, whether it's journals, diary entries, maps, or newspapers where they can find out battles and skirmishes and about where they took place. Or they can find different camps or forts, prisons that might still be around from the time and base their research and sites off of there. By doing this, we're not only able to find new locations, but we might also be able to find and learn more about different areas that we already have some research on. Now, site locations in the background of the sites. The objects, such as what we have pictured here, are very useful for today's research. Right here we have a sketch that was done by a Union soldier during the Battle of Petersburg, and it details the locations of soldiers, artillery, roads, and trenches that were used during the battle. The map here we have was drawn by James Kness. He was a part of the 36th Wisconsin Infantry. Now, after finding a site, you have to survey the site. Now, two types of surveys that will be conducted. The first would be creating a general map of the site, including any natural features like trees, water, or any significant geological or geographic features, as well as a very detailed topography and soil documentation. The other survey conducted is a surface level artifact sweep. That means that they'll just walk over the ground, look, and if they see any artifacts that might be out in the open, they will mark them down on their maps. After the initial surveying is completed, Archaeologists then decide whether or not further investigation is needed or if they're able to leave the site alone. If they decide to investigate, the next step will be conducting what is known as shovel testing all across the site. Shovel test is when the archaeologists dig small test pits, typically about meter by meter, at regular intervals across the site in order to look for different artifacts or features that might be buried underneath the surface. If these tests end up yielding positive results or indicate that there might be a lot more to find, archaeologists can then move on to conducting larger excavations. By doing this, archaeologists will dig and brush away soil and rock layers one at a time, documenting every artifact or historic feature that is found at the site. Now, from what we find after surveying, finding the sites, doing research on where the sites might be, and finding any artifacts or features at those sites, we then move on to interpreting and preserving the artifacts and features. And by doing this, we're not only able to educate people today about what occurred during the events of the Civil War, but we're able to perform research on the materials and artifacts and features found. For artifacts, all that can be done for this is putting together museum exhibits so we can provide the public with information while properly preserving the objects. For large features like forts, they might be open to the public as historic sites where you can take tours, while historic preservationists work to keep the structures safe and intact. Sometimes, however, the best way for us to learn and protect these sites is just to leave them alone. And pictured here, we do have the American Civil War Museum in Richmond, Virginia. Now, we've talked quite a bit about the excavation and finding sites and going through the process of getting the different artifacts out. And now we're going to look a little bit more into the different ethics and regulations associated with archaeology. Now, while it is very important for research that we investigate, excavate, and then work to find more archaeological materials from the Civil War, it is also important that we follow the rules while doing so, make sure that we are allowed to do it. So we're going to go over a few different laws that are associated with archaeology. The first law itself is the National Historic Preservation Act. This was introduced in 1966, and it is perhaps the most wide-ranging and impactful law governing how archaeologists are able to work. The law itself gave historic places here in the United States a lot more protection, with most important being Section 106 of the law. Section 106 itself applies to any federally recognized historic site, whether it was archaeological, historical buildings, battlegrounds, etc. Basically, Section 106 talks about and states that any project or activity that is done on or near these sites must first be subjected to a very thorough documentation of any risk or hazards that might impact the protected sites. It also made it law that before doing anything on historic sites that could potentially be harmful to the artifacts or features, one must document the dangers of the activities in detail, how these dangers will be mitigated before any work can be done. It is one of the most important parts of the federal archaeology today as we continue to protect and preserve both historic and archaeological sites. All land that is federally controlled falls under the protection of this act. Now, another important act we have is the Archaeological Resource Protection Act of 1979. This went further towards protecting specifically archaeological sites from damage. The act itself is laid out basic do's and don'ts of what you are able to do at these sites. And it specifically goes and talks more about acts that are illegal to do, like excavating or removing artifacts from protected properties without permission, selling, exchanging, or transporting artifacts illegally removed from protected areas. And this act itself basically adds upon the National Historic Preservation Act and the Antiquities Act of 1906. Now, when working on a lot of these sites, even though they are primarily Civil War sites, we do run into finding some different Native American sites. And NAGPRA, or the Native American Graves Protection and Retribution Act of 1990, is the main act that we must be mindful while working under these conditions. Even at the Civil War sites, we are able to find different Native American remains and burial goods in those areas, and NAGPRA allows us to properly excavate, preserve, or relocate any of the Native American remains or artifacts found at any of these archaeological sites, usually with consultation with the different local Native American tribal leaders or officials in the area that would be associated with the potential tribes of the burials we have found. Now, the big question that might be on your mind outside of how does this help map the Civil War is, why do we excavate these sites? Well, if we already know a lot from the Civil War, from the different primary resources, even have some photos of different wars and battles going on, why do we still excavate and look for different buried materials? Well, archaeologists themselves only perform these excavations if they believe there is research that can be done on the artifacts or features that are found, or if there are items of human remains that must be left alone and protected. They don't just randomly decide one day to go dig up all the sites for fun. They have to have a purpose behind the work, like finding out what type of munitions were used during battles or what was being used inside different forts or camps. Now, when it comes to finding the sites and different artifacts or features there, a big question that they run into is whether they excavate or preserve them. The Civil War itself is a conflict that left many dead and a lot more wounded. One big question when human remains from Civil War soldiers are found is if they should be excavated or left there. This can sometimes be a very complicated question. Typically, if we rediscover the burials of soldiers, we can investigate but not disturb the remains. This means that we can excavate the site and see if the site itself has any research potential from the different artifacts or features there. And once that is completed, they are able to rebury and properly mark to help preserve the site. The reason that burials may be rediscovered is because of any markers or tombstones created for the burials during the Civil War, and especially near different battles, were often done hastily. It did not survive over the past 180 years. Therefore, we want to continue respecting those that we did not find or mark to preserve the sites properly. Sometimes we have to excavate due to problems that are occurring to us today. The photo on the left here shows a team of archaeologists excavating at Fort Craig in New Mexico, where multiple Civil War soldiers are buried. In 2008 and 2009, grave robbers disturbed 67 different burials at this site and stole countless artifacts buried along with these soldiers. And due to this, federal archaeologists completely excavated the fort's cemetery and took a complete inventory of every human remain and burial. Now, another point towards Civil War archaeology is what happens when we find the remains from medical care being given to the different soldiers in their camps. When we find human remains that were removed from the soldiers during amputations, archaeologists do not typically rebury them. Instead, they preserve them in either museums or storage facilities for further research. Pictured here, we have a bone from an amputated limb of a Union soldier at the Battle of Bull Run. Not really sure if it was the first or the second battle there. And as many of you might be aware, amputations were not the most precise ordeals for these soldiers to have to go through, or the physicians to actually be able to do during the war. However, at Bull Run, archaeologists have found many amputated bones cut incredibly clean, such as the one we have pictured here, which shows us that field physicians in the Union Army camps might have been extremely skilled. Now, on rare occasions during these digs, archaeologists may uncover Civil War artifacts that can be dangerous to the public, even today. A prime example of dangerous artifacts are unexploded cannon munitions, many of which were packaged with gunpowder or other types of explosives. If these munitions were fired but did not explode, they may have gone many feet into the ground and not have been touched since. If a member of the public walking around today through one of the battlefields and artifacts such as the cannon of munition here can pose a serious risk to them. So it is important for archaeologists to handle these properly. If these types of objects were found today, the most common way to deal with them is to do what they were meant to do 180 years ago, which is to blow them up. This was the case in 2021 at Beaver Creek in Maryland, where members of the public spotted a Civil War cannonball underneath a fallen tree. The cannonball happened to be filled with explosive material, and it was decided that the best way to deal with the threat was to detonate the munition. The photo on the left, shared by the Maryland Fire Marshal, shows an almost identical and thankfully non-explosive cannonball compared to the one disposed of. Another serious danger posed by the Civil War artifacts even today is the fact that items made of materials such as lead or things such as gunpowder may contaminate modern waterways. As soil itself naturally erodes near creeks and rivers, such items may become uncovered, and it is important for archaeologists to excavate and properly store these items before they can harm people today. Now, how is Civil War archaeology unique? Well, there are many reasons that make Civil War archaeology itself unique. One reason specifically concerns how we have to think about sites of battles from the war. If you take a look at the picture, you would see different ways to represent the stratification of soil or different materials given in the land. Now, when discussing the different cultural resources, the layers that are placed in can get quite complicated. Now, if the archaeology of the war, such as what we're able to see throughout a lot of different Civil War sites, imagine taking an already complicated cultural stratification and adding a couple explosions. War itself is chaotic, and the Civil War battlefields are often no different. Objects and human remains can be found in places you wouldn't typically expect them to be found, and they may have been displaced during events of the war or after the war. This is also why it is very important to have a good background before actually investigating these sites. So this is the picture that was supposed to pop up with the different soils, different layers and the stratifications of it. So I'll leave that up for a minute or two so that you can gaze upon all of its glory, think back about what we had talked about. And I think that moment of its glory is past. So we're going to move on to the next one. Different methodologies used when looking and trying to find the sites. The first one I'll talk about is GIS. Now, as I mentioned at the start, GIS is Geographic Information Systems. Now, it's another tool that is commonly used by archaeologists today to further study archaeological sites and to help better store data regarding these sites. GIS is actually more than just a tool. It's a term that refers to many different types of remote sensing and the analysis that can be done using this data. But that can get pretty complicated, so we're just going to stick with calling it GIS. By utilizing GIS, archaeologists can map down to the millimeter the boundaries of the site, different locations of artifacts or features, and where more work needs to be done. When the data itself is entered into the GIS software, it is also possible for researchers to perform spatial analysis or analyze the relationships between different points at a site. GIS itself is not only popular for research to be performed, but is also the best way to store information and distribute it to others within an agency or organization. Overall, GIS just makes life a lot easier for a lot of researchers or archaeologists. The photo we have here is a GIS visual of the epitome. Now, this is another example of GIS work being done. The pictures here is a set of data from the Battle of Petersburg, and it shows just how archaeologists can view the different data points from the site using GIS software. Now, outside of GIS, there are some other methodologies used. we have GPR, or ground penetrating radar. GPR itself can be a very incredible tool to use in archaeology because it shows us what is in the ground before we even have to dig. GPR data can show us how far we can expect to dig before we find any artifacts or features, and it may even be able to show what we are exactly looking and expecting to uncover. The photo on the left is an example of what GPR data looks like. And you can see here the red mark outlines an object or collection of objects spanning about 20 to 40 meters into the ground. By combining multiple sets of GPR scans, archaeologists can even create three-dimensional renderings of what's beneath the surface of the site. And on the right, you can see an archaeologist actually using the device that penetrates the ground with the radar. Now here's some more examples of what GPR pictures end up looking like. And this is all from a different excavation site, and it shows the different layers in which artifacts might be found. Now another methodology used is LiDAR, or light detection and ranging. This is typically done by flying a small plane with a specialized LiDAR device sticking out of the doors to scan the ground below. Now, LiDAR scans utilize lasers that can visualize the surface of the land while removing all nearby vegetation. This leaves us with data that can show down to a few centimeters every divot, crevice, and bump in the land. This data can be incredibly useful to archaeologists, as it can be used to locate new sites within heavily forested areas that were not previously known. As well, LiDAR scans can give supplemental data to already existing sites, and it may even reveal details of the landscape not immediately known or immediately obvious to ground observers. Now, this is a LiDAR scan from the site of the Battle of Petersburg, and you can make out a few different landscape features in the image, and a few features have already been highlighted. All right, some more context for the LiDAR example. If anyone was interested in what the LiDAR scan material would look like on the ground, this image was taken from a signal tower just south of Fort Connolly after the battle. And we are able to see the fort, rows of obstacles, picket lines, the Confederate picket fosse. Just have a better view and understanding of what the battlefield would look like. Well, today you listened to me go over a lot of different ways in which archaeologists today go about trying to map and learn about different Civil War sites, as well as the different ways to look at deciding whether or not features, artifacts, or the sites should be preserved, protected, excavated. So hopefully, listening to me ramble on, you've learned a little bit more about how we are able to learn more today about the Civil War outside of just first-person sources, and think about all the hard work that goes into excavating all of the different artifacts or features you might see when visiting different Civil War sites, exhibits in museums, and etc. So that's all I had for you, PowerPoint-wise. I'd like to thank you all for sticking it out with me. Hope you enjoyed it and learned something. So if anyone has any questions about anything I've talked about, feel free to ask them now, and I'll do my best to answer them.
If you find human remains in the battlefield, is there an attempt made to bury them, or are they left where they were found?
If they are unearthed, typically after the data has been found and everything's been cataloged, they'll just be reburied in the same spot. Now, with erosion, there have been some instances of where the skeletal remains just breach the surface, and for those instances, they will relocate them to a different burial site. But if they themselves have unearthed the skeletons, they will then rebury them in the same spot they were found. Yes.
You mentioned about finding bones and things like that. Do they try to maybe see if, use through DNA, see if they might be related to somebody today? You know, was it a relative? You know, if they do anything like that, or?
I do not believe that is a main priority they have. In some cases, depending on the battle or request, they might, but for the most part, they are typically just finding more information about the area itself, what they might have been doing at the time of, in this case, their death, things that might have led up to their death, how they lived beforehand, not fully into the genealogy of their family line afterwards. Mm-hmm.
Have you worked on any sites?
I have not had the privilege to work on any sites for excavation. We have in the past at the Garfield House had some excavations done, but that was long before my time was there. And we do not have any current plans of excavating anymore. So unless that happens in the next year or so, I will still have no experience yet.